Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Freeing Your Mind podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Dukeman, and this week I have with me Mr. Rob Hollingsworth. Rob, how you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, happy to have you on. So, Rob, let's get right into it. What's your background? Tell us about yourself. Who are you?
I grew up in Washington State. Um, Lived there for about 20 something years. Joined the military, joined the Navy. I was an explosive detection canine handler. But I always had the goal of going into law enforcement, like on a civilian side. So I did that right after the Navy. I got out in 2016, got hired within a couple months down in Henderson, Nevada, which is in Las Vegas. Was there for 3 years. Then I lateraled back to Washington State, where I was in Tacoma, which is just south of Seattle. I did that just shy of 3 years there. I was on a SWAT team there. And then I since transitioned out of law enforcement in March of 22. So now I'm a full-on entrepreneur out of public service for the first time in over a decade. So it's interesting.
Nice. Yeah, it's a strange feeling, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a little 2 year stint of that when I had a grocery store in the Midwest, and it was weird. It was suddenly a weird shift. Like you'd hear sirens and stuff, and you're like, "What's going on?" Right?
Yeah.
Nobody's calling me. What's going on?
I don't care.
Yeah, and then you just start to go into that. Yeah, I don't care. So it's an interesting transition, but um, so in your time in law enforcement, military, what was that like for you?
It was good. I mean, I enjoyed it. I do love public service. I have three kids now, and I left law enforcement. Like that was always my goal, was to be a SWAT officer, but life and society and just it didn't make sense for me to stay into that.
Mm,
Um, and keep risking my life and then leave my kids here, So I just couldn't articulate doing it any longer. Um, but I mean, there's going to be stuff I always miss about it. But yeah, I had some pretty crazy stuff go on in my 6 years in law enforcement. Military was, yeah, it's kind of just bland, to be honest with you. But
yeah,
law enforcement was out of this world.
yeah. So in that law enforcement end of things, I mean, we all know that some of it's the adrenaline rush, some of it's the good calls, some of it's the bad calls. How did you cope with all that? And keeping your
Yeah,
head straight during that time?
yeah, that's kind of. I don't think I coped with it until after I was gone, to be honest with you.
Mm,
So going through, I mean, I saw you name it, I saw it. Um, and I always felt like I was good. I mean, I wasn't batshit off the walls, but like, you're always, I'm sure you hear it too, where the guys are like, oh, yeah, I'm fine. Why is the psychologist in the briefing room, et cetera, et cetera. And I was always one of those guys, like, the hell's this guy doing here? Um, yeah, there you go. They teach you to compartmentalize. So you say, oh, you know, one call at a time and then stick it away.
mm,
And that stuff just compounds over time. So after I got out, specifically after about 6 months, my brain just started kind of reopening those doors and just it was out of my control. And just, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And after about 6 months, I was like, okay, well, I think I'm going to address some of this issue. Stuff that I'd even forgot about too
mm.
just pops up. So you see something that triggers it and you're like, oh, I forgot about that. But yeah, is coping along the way. I don't think I really was coping. Mine was just kind of stash it away, shut the door, lock and key, and on to the next call.
Yeah, and which certainly happens. That it's we all have a choice of how we deal with that. And a lot of times, because it's on to the next call, we stash it away and we're like, yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to it. And before you know it, you just never did, until eventually it
Yeah.
decides, hey, no, it's time, and you don't have that choice. So once you started kind of seeing that stuff come out, what was your course of action?
Well, I know about 5 or 6 guys personally that have killed themselves in the last 2 years. and some change. And then I had a close friend of mine that was on SWAT with. He took his life last July, I believe, and that was kind of the tipping point, I think, for me, because I had been out for about 6 months at that point too. Than that, and I was just kind of like, oh God, I never was, actively suicidal or anything like that, but I think I had enough head on my shoulders to realize, like, hey, what was this guy feeling X amount of years prior to? Is this the course? Is this the trajectory? I don't know.
Mhm.
So I was like, all right, well, I'm just gonna go out, and so I started going to counseling, like first responders counseling, which was effective. And then I started kind of looking into treatments. I did the EMDR once, which was a pretty crazy experience. But then I was actually contacted by a guy on LinkedIn named Dan Jarvis, who's got a program called 220. And he's no joke. He says, I could heal you in one session over Zoom. And I'm like, of course I'm a cop, so I was BS, right?
Yeah.
He goes, no, he goes, just try it out. It's free. And so I did that, man. And there's a little process you do, but it was pretty crazy. But yeah, it was very, very beneficial. So that's kind of the trajectory there. But like we were talking about earlier before we started, it's going to always be something you have to work on and work through.
Yeah. So what method does Dan use with 22-0?
So I don't know if there's a name for it. So I don't want to butcher it, but basically what it is, so they get your levels. So they'll check you on your post-traumatic stress, your depression, and your anxiety. Go through a bunch of questions beforehand, calculate your scores, and give you basically a score like on that level. My depression and anxiety were like minimal trace amounts, like any normal person would have. But my PTSD was, and anything over, I think it's on an 80-point scale. Um, and anything over like a 32 or 33 is considered combat related PTSD. And I was a 63 or 64, something like that. And of course, I still don't know, like, whoa, what does that mean? And she goes, anything at 70, we consider you actively suicidal. And I was like, oh my God. So it kind of light bulb went off. I'm like, there's so many first responders cruising around, at that level, and they might not even know it.
Mm.
And as that threshold comes down, because they're used to their misery basically, but they're still at that level. So I was like, oh, that's nuts. So then basically what you do is you're one-on-one with somebody. You don't talk about the incident at all. It's like visualization. So I'm sure there's a term for it, but I don't know it.
Mm.
But basically, like you think about each incident, and then they like take you in it and out of it, and just they're rewiring something, and then they tell you don't think about that thing for at least 3 days because your brain is acting this. It's very interesting, but I would highly recommend it to anybody listening to this.
Interesting. And there's so much out there, so it's always interesting to hear about something new that
Yeah,
that somebody has tried, because a lot of people will kind of stick to maybe just this one thing that they heard about. Like EMDR is really popular. And it
yeah,
usually for a lot of people has a really positive effect, and some people they get so far and then it doesn't, or it just doesn't work for them. But
yeah.
there is some people that was their cure all. So it's always
I think a
interesting
lot of
to
people grasp
revisit.
onto it,
Mhm.
and then they're comfortable in it.
Yeah, it is definitely whatever works for you, and those just having more information about any new thing is always a great thing.
Yeah,
So that was just one session.
one session I did it probably almost 2 months ago.
Okay,
And then so they do a post level, and I had my PTSD was down to trace amounts.
interesting.
It's
That's good.
Yeah, I just kind of just tell people I just felt lighter.
Mm.
That's the best way to describe it. It's hard to describe. I think the whole realm of PTSD is harder to describe. People, unless you've been through this stuff, like they don't understand it. And mine, I don't Now, trust me, I've had some really crazy incidents in law enforcement, but I think it's the repetitiveness, just like I'm sure it is with you. It's like just so much compounding
Mhm.
trauma. Like it could be even small things. It's like, but it's just compounding and compounding and compounding, and then you never get any downtime. You never get any break.
Yep.
And I mean, for me, that's what got me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it's that maybe those small things initially weren't ever an issue, but because you've stacked so many big things in there that now all of a sudden that little small thing is a bad thing.
Yeah,
Like your backpack's so full that you can't keep putting rocks in there, and even just that little pebble's enough to strain you and feel it. So
right.
it is kind of a weird thing how it works, and it is always interesting hearing from other people the similarities, because I think there's a lot of similarities, but a lot of times as we're going through it, we definitely feel like no one else understands this. At least that was how it was for me, and I've heard that from some other people that you're just kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, I I just feel this way, and it just is what it is. Nobody understands. I'm on my own here. And then
That's
once I
because the culture.
yeah, absolutely. And that's a big thing that we're trying to change is the culture,
Yeah.
because there is so much available out there now, and the culture really is changing. And the more that we are just willing to get into the treatment and dive into that and just get it done, and to actually have a desire to fix the problem instead of burying it, the more that culture is going to change.
Yeah.
And it's definitely all about changing that culture, and I think a lot of it's changed. Like even talking to a few weeks ago, I'd interviewed a friend of mine that I started out in fire with, and that he works for Cal Fire, and that agency has changed so much over the years. I mean,
Hmm.
when I was in, it just kind of started with the like little briefings after calls. Like maybe the captain would just be like, "Talk to everybody individual. Are you okay? That was kind of bad. You okay?" And of course, you're feeling singled out when they ask you, so you're like, "No, I'm good. Yeah, it's no problem." And but there was never like a, hey, we're gonna actually sit down and deal with this. The really bad calls, like 4 years or so into my career, they were starting to do stress debriefings afterwards, where they get everybody involved in the call in a day or two.
Yeah.
That was still inconsistent because a lot of times nobody would say that they thought it was a good idea. They'd still start out with like,
Hmm.
you know, it's pretty rough call. Do you think that would be helpful to you? Well, nobody wants to say yeah. Like, yeah, I want to sit in a room with a bunch of people that just went through this, and I want to be the one that made it all happen. Like it just has this
Well,
negative feeling to it.
yeah, we did that. Two, gosh, it must have been summer 2020. We had a police canine get shot and killed. We were going after a murder suspect, and um, we ended up shooting him. But we do a debrief a couple weeks later, and the way they did it, so they had like the oncoming shift. So I mean, there's 60 people sitting in a room, and maybe 10 of us were actually there.
Mm,
And they go, "Yeah, we're gonna do a debrief. So whoever's there or whoever wants to stick around."
mm,
And I'm like, "Well, okay." And then so what it ended up coming into was the people that weren't there were asking questions and then interjecting their opinions
yeah,
on the debrief. And then us when we're there, we're just like, "Okay, I guess it's your show." And then we just left and it was never addressed again.
yeah.
So it's like,
And,
yes, they're changing the culture, but stuff like that is very prevalent.
yeah, and really, like I do think that they got it right in a lot of cases with debriefs where they only had the people who were involved. They might have brought in a team to manage the debrief that wasn't there,
Yeah, that's
but
acceptable.
it was not like, oh, you're the other shift. Here, come in and get in on this train wreck with us, you know.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be the way it goes down, because
Nope.
there is so much of that, like, well, let me just interject this. It's like, well, you don't know, like you experienced something similar maybe, but you weren't there at this particular incident. Like it's each one's different.
Yes.
So I could see that being quite an ineffective start of the shift or end
Yeah,
of the
I
shift
actually had an
of being
argument with one of the other officers who wasn't there because he said something and I said no. this is what should have been done for X, Y, and Z. And he goes, well, that's, and I was like, okay. I just shut up at that point. I was like, all right, whatever, dude.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how we are trying to change the culture, but sometimes I think that it's just going through the motions and
Yeah.
not really actually striving to correct the problem and to
I
actually
think
fix it.
I've thought about just that. And it's like at some point, like you could offer help to people, especially in these like these lines of work, but until they reach that point where they, okay, I'm gonna go out and
Uh,
get some help. You know what I mean? Did I break up?
yeah. Yeah. So you said until they reach that point.
Yeah, everybody has to reach the point. I think that's, but some people they're not reaching that point. They're just jumping to the end, which we know is the result of that. Um, but you could lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
Mhm.
You could even put them in counseling, but if they're not really engaged and focused on actually healing, then nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. And I've been involved with departments that have talked about doing some things like some of the law enforcement agencies do it already, and some of the fire departments do too, where like mandatory, like once a year, twice a year, you just have to go in and talk with a counselor. And that, but it's kind
Yeah,
of like you
checking
can
the
just,
box.
yeah, you can just check the box. You can actually take it seriously and unload some stuff, or you can talk about fishing and football, whatever you want. You just got to check. You just got to be there for an hour, and
Yeah,
and it at least gives the opportunity, right, to you're there. Well, I'm here. I don't know. Maybe I just should say something and just deal with what's on my mind. It at least gives you that chance because you're already in front of the person that can help. But if you don't want to be vulnerable, if you don't want to take that, then it's just an hour out of your day that you're annoyed with.
yeah. Well, think about it. Like I didn't, so to like set the stage, I didn't feel like I was at a 63 or whatever
Mm,
throughout my entire career for 10 years, or
mm,
whenever I reached that spot. I didn't feel like that because that threshold is keep going up, right? So
yeah.
you pack on all these incidents and your stress levels change, or your ability to adapt to stress, or adapt to stress.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you don't feel that way. So you might be sitting in that room and then you're like, oh, well, I'm fine. But you might be a 70. Like you just, until you reach that point where you make that decision yourself, I it's you got to come up with some creative ways. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I don't know if
Yeah.
there is one answer.
And I think a lot of it just starts with people coming in at this point, that the veterans that have been in the agency, that have been in the business for a while, need to, just like they have always, it's always been those guys that have been around forever that train the new guys coming in. They need to train them on this. They need to recognize that, hey, you know, you're starting out this career and you think it's cool and it's fun, but this is going to happen more than
Yeah.
likely. And you need to understand that it's totally acceptable. It's not normal for people to deal with the things that you're going to deal with, whether that's chasing bad guys and getting involved in shootings, having to shoot somebody, whether it's just a horrific call involving children, or any, whatever the unimaginable is, that it's not normal to see these things. You're signing up to
Yep.
see these things, so you need to understand that when you see them and they affect you in a negative way, the most normal thing you can do is ask for help and to change
Mm-hmm.
that culture with that new generation coming in. Because you tend to see with a lot of anything really, like the older you get, the less willing you are to change. That's something that I recognized in my mid 20s when I owned a business. I was like, man, like some of these people just like they can't handle the change. And then I was like, well, they've been doing it for 20 years. And now all of a
Yeah.
sudden they're not the young person anymore in there, and they've just been doing it forever, and because it's always been this way, that's the way it's always got to be. So it's harder for the crowd that's been there to change.
Yeah.
But if we can at least impart a different way of thinking on the new generation coming in, I think that'll play a huge role in continuing
Yeah.
to evolve and to destigmatize trauma and PTSD in these areas.
You know what I think would be the most effective thing would be to have like specifically law enforcement is to have people where they come off the road for, and it's got to be a little bit of an extended time, like a few months, 3 to 6 months, like you're not responding to calls, and just have like a rotating basis, like every, I don't know, 1 to 2 years, and they just rotate. Be very hard to pull off, especially as the there's no manning anymore, but that would be very effective because that would allow you to kind of take a step back and just be like, kind of feel like yourself again,
Mm.
and then you could see. So then maybe you make that leap. I'm like, oh yeah, I think.
Oh, froze up again. Got you back now.
Yeah, this internet sucks.
It's all part of the joy of technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a way to do that and actually get people off the patrol beat for a little bit. I know some places where I've lived, like the sheriff's department, you're pretty much doing a rotation at the jail, at least to get in the
Oh
door. And that actually, growing up, that actually was one of the things why I never wanted to work for the sheriff's department because I didn't want to be a jailer. And like
oh,
knew
that's horrible.
people, had friends that were, and like great group of guys and women, but I'm just like, yeah, I don't want to go to jail for work. It doesn't sound good.
Nope.
Like I'm not a criminal because I don't want to go to jail.
Yeah.
And every time I would go and like get a tour of the jail, or I'd be like at a training and my buddy would be running central and he'd call me or text me and be like, hey, when you're done with that, because he's watching all the cameras, he could see it was
Yeah.
like, yeah, when you're done, like call me. Let's hang out. So then you call him up, done with the class or on a break, and he buzzes you in the door, and that door closes behind you, and you just hear it latch, and you're like, God, I hate this. Like I hate it.
It's
Like there's
terrible.
zero control. And
Yeah.
even sitting in central where they're running all the switches, you're like, this sucks. Like
Yeah.
I'm in this
No
little,
daylight.
yeah, no daylight. I'm in this box. There's a bunch of screens. I can see what everybody's doing, but I can't leave.
Yeah.
Somebody has to let me out. Like, no, I'm good. Like, you can't pay me enough money.
In Vegas, I used to do it overtime because
Yeah.
they were so short staffed. So they'd bring, I never did that for a job. I was patrol,
Mm.
but they'd bring patrol guys on for 12-hour shifts at like double time, which was good money. And I'd always be like, all right, give me if they call it the worker dorm, which is like the guys that have earned the rights to a TV and stuff. So I'd go in there,
What you said
lose
you'd
it
go
again.
yeah, you'd go in the worker dorm.
Yeah, and I'd give them the remote for the TV, and I say, "Don't bother me. I'm here for 12 hours. Watch TV, do whatever you want. Don't cause any issues." They love me. Every time I'd go in there, they'd be like, "Hey, what's up, officer? Officer Hollingsworth." I'm like, "Here you go. Here's a remote. Don't talk to me."
Yeah. I'll be good to you, you be good to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I think if that was my alternative to being on patrol, I'd just stay on patrol. But if you could find something that was a good fit, that I don't know. I mean, I know some guys that they're in the oh, I forget what it's even called here, but they basically go to be like a resource officer at some of the high schools,
School resource officer.
and some of them love it. Like they're just like,
Yeah.
man, it's cake, like and of course, being a firefighter, I pick on them a little bit. I'm like, well, of course, like you want to be popular your whole life, and then you became a cop, so now you're hanging out the high school, and you're the popular kid for once. As a grown up, and they're like, oh, but it's just in fun. But they enjoy it because they get to do something other than go out and scratch tickets all day and deal with the uglier side of things. And if they're dealing with somebody, it's like the kid that got in trouble and he's got like cigarettes, so they're just kind of like, I guess, probably more putting the fear of God into them than
Yeah.
than you know sending them to jail, writing them tickets, and all that stuff. So I think some of them really like that, and that could be potentially like a really good rotation for some of those guys, especially if you're
Oh,
able
yeah,
to
that'd
impact
be.
youth in
Mhm.
a positive way during that time.
Yeah, I could see that working.
Yeah, but that is an interesting concept because I think that that time away. does also allow your mind to just process. You're not piling that stuff in anymore, so it gives it time to kind of just work itself out organically. Or even if you choose to just go and help make that be a catalyst to make that happen.
Right.
So you weren't SWAT down in Henderson, were you? You were just a patrol officer down there?
No, I lateraled. Yeah. Tacoma was.
Okay. And so I think certainly like been pretty fortunate to live in a lot of rural areas, although I have worked in some busier places too, and some of the cities. But I can only imagine that some of those bigger areas, I mean, Tacoma's pretty big. It's been a long time since I've been up
Yeah.
there.
Don't go.
Yeah, Henderson, that whole area is big. So I mean, your call volume is going to be up there. So you're just going to
Yep.
be bombarded in your shift. I would imagine you're most of the time just off and running.
Yeah, I was graveyard for 5 out of the 6 years, even probably more than that. Um, and yeah, call volume. Henderson was pretty much probably 20 to 30 calls a night.
Mhm.
Como was a little bit less, I would say. They just operate a little bit differently. Um, both very violent cities. I mean, my first in my first 2 years in Henderson as a brand new officer, like I probably was exposed to stuff that many officers in other parts of the country will never see in their life.
Mm.
So it kind of does depend. They all get exposed to stuff, but when you're working in those type of environments, it's pretty substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. And did they, when you went through post, did they prepare you for any of that? Was that discussed? Or when you got hired on with your department, was it discussed?
When I went through post,
Oh, okay. You did cut out. When you went through post, was any of that, did they prepare you for any of that? Was it discussed? Did your department prepare you for any of it?
no, I mean, I think it's just hammered into us that it was like, hey, be ready because you guys are going to be thrown into this stuff right away. And they weren't lying.
Yeah.
Um, they were always saying, hey, we live in Las Vegas. Like, there's going to be an attack on the strip. So be ready for that. They're like, yeah, we used to say, like, most officers don't get in officer involved shootings. They're like, unfortunately, now you more than likely will be in a shooting or a situation where you're going to have to defend yourself or for your life. But yeah, it wasn't like, I don't think there was any, I don't remember any like mental health stuff. And they weren't, I mean, I was there for Route 91. I got a shooting in 2018. So 2 years on the job. I checked both those off.
Yeah.
I mean, people going after their own kids, terrible car accidents, like you name it, like crazy stuff happens there. And then Tacoma was just kind of more of the same, just with a bunch of crap mixed into it.
Yeah. And it's kind of wild. I actually had Josh Nielsen on a few weeks ago, and he
Yeah,
talked
we were on the
about,
same department.
yeah, talked about Route 91 and that going down, and just like the sheer level of that. Even I can imagine, even not if you were in a circumstance where you weren't directly involved with that, but you saw a lot of your colleagues that were, the
Hmm.
changes that took place in them, and
Yeah.
and just seeing those shifts were
So the
probably
whole city, to
pretty
be honest
wild.
with you,
Yeah.
I don't know if Josh said that, but for me, that was pretty crazy because it was Vegas is kind of weird. It's a big city, but it's got small town feels because most
Yeah.
people are transient. They're in and out.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I had to drive back. I worked probably like an 18-hour shift that night. So I got home at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. And I remember seeing the blinds coming out of the window of Mandalay Bay from the broken window. So that's burned into my brain as
Mm.
I'm driving home from work, exhausted. Like I see that, right? And that's the last thing I see before I go to sleep and come back and do it again the next night.
Yeah.
Just stuff like that you don't really think about.
Yeah, and it is always interesting the things that do stick, because when when I started, I think you froze up again. When I started, to me being like an 18-year-old kid, I had always just kind of envisioned like, you watch like the old war movies and like the thing that the guy's flashing back on is like some gory, like horrible
Yeah.
thing of his buddy just having been shot or something. But a lot of times that isn't the image that sticks with you. It's the smell, it's the taste, it's the weather, what it was like that
Yeah.
day, or just some random image like the blinds or whatever that
Yep.
happens to be that triggers that some sound. And and it's fascinating to me that it is that way because while I still can see a lot of those things, and some of them were the gory things, but it's the other sensories and the other random things that you see that trigger that response.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just fascinating because how we deal with those things, a lot of times we don't know they're there until they pop up, and then you're in that
Right.
place.
That's what's crazy about law enforcement versus like the military.
Mhm.
Military, you flip a switch when you go to the airport, you're like, all right, going overseas, and you bring it back with you, but a lot of the triggers are left over there.
Mhm.
You go into a place where you live and you're driving around on an afternoon with your family and you go to an intersection where three people just burned alive or whatever.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, it's a very weird feeling
Yep.
because
And
they don't
that's
know. They're like
no.
talking about Target or something.
Yep. And that's actually been the most reoccurring comment that I've had in all the conversations I've had with other first responders and military guys, is that a lot of them are like, yeah, I left all my shit in Iraq. I left all my shit
Yeah.
in Afghanistan. They still had problems and things that they had to deal with, but there was very few, like there was things that would trigger it, but they never go back to that neighborhood. They're
Nope.
never going back to Kandahar to grab a cookie or something. Like it's just not happening. And where with the first responders, you're very much going to drive through that intersection again. You're going to drive by a house. And over time, pretty soon, every street has a story. A lot of houses have a story. Uh, you will run into people that you were on calls that were either a bystander or a victim. So now that triggers something when you see that person randomly at the grocery store. So
Yeah.
it's those repeat things. And for me, I always initially when I joined the fire service, I never really realized it because I worked about an hour from where I lived. And then I started volunteering with the local fire department where I lived. So then all of a sudden, like the whole highway going to work, because we had
Yeah.
a huge response area, every bend in the road has a story, from somebody
Yeah.
crashing here, something burning up there, the crazy guy shooting at the cop car here. Yeah, I mean, just all these wild things that happen. And so then you kind of you can't really get away from it anymore. So
Yep.
had I known what I know now, I would have been like, well, I guess I probably should deal with these things since I can't get away from them, and at least file them properly.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree, man. The getting away, you got to have a time to remove yourself from it.
Absolutely. So, um, what is it that you're doing now? I know you got your hands in all kinds of stuff, but
Yes, I
how
do.
so what's that transition looking like for you?
So transition, I mean, like the first 6 months was a struggle for me. Um, but I think it's getting that right. But yeah, I'm crushing after it now. I started a business, totally random. I kind of stumbled upon this industry. I think God sends you, I don't know if you're a religious man, but God sends or the universe sends you stuff your way and you can kind of take it or spit it back out. I was sent into this, and so I'm doing back in the roofing consulting industry. So I do a lot of like insurance claim work and inspections. So I'm actually I started a national one. So there's a couple actually other den members that are involved in it. Bob Greenway out in
Yeah.
Denver, and I've been talking a lot about it. Him and some people in Texas. So I'm actually able to scale it across the country pretty quick.
Nice.
But that's what we're doing. And then my goal is to build that up to where the business is running. So I'm able to build. I think that's super important with young kids. So I'm trying to build that. And then hopefully, oh, one day I will, kind of let it do its thing, bring in some other people, they run it. And ultimately, that's my goal, is to get some land and raise my kids. So that's
Nice.
what I'm focused on.
Perfect. Sounds good. Yeah. So, I mean that, like you said, the transition that first few months, but it sounds like you've really hit the ground running since then.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely getting my hands. I was still, trying to find my new path, basically. Just
Yeah.
me, I got to be passionate about something. I have to like, otherwise I just kind of float, and I'm just not. If I don't feel like I'm into something, then I'm just not going to do it. I was actually a firefighter for 3 weeks. It was the most, no offense, it was the worst
Yeah.
job I ever
Yeah. It's not for
had.
everybody.
Dude, I hated it.
Yeah.
I'm like, in a third of my life, like I was like, nah, I'm done with the public service. Did
Yeah.
it for 3 weeks. One 24-hour shift. And I was like, nah, not for me, man. Y'all could have it.
Yeah. It's definitely a lot of that. And like even like I did my little dabble in law enforcement when I worked with the Forest Service, and it was kind of like I liked it, but in the end, like a lot of people were like, why? Like, why are you just, they're not making you write tickets, don't do it. And I was like, yeah, but
Right.
I mean, like some people just they need that in their life because they don't understand the any other way. But the things that you deal with because of it, like
Yeah.
yeah, I can kind of see like yeah, I put my back up against a wall now because of you're not making friends. Everybody loves a firefighter. Nobody freaking loves cops. And you're like, man, you only like them if they come and actually help you. But you're always going to remember the time you got that ticket and you were going 15 miles an hour over, but you're still mad that he gave you a ticket. So it's
Yeah.
just a weird dynamic that all those things, like it's not for everybody, but uh, you
No,
know, sometimes you just got to try it, just dabble in it a minute, just so you
wasn't
can
for me.
say it's not for you. So, if people wanted to reach out to you and maybe wanted to find out more about you, what you do, or just wanted to talk about anything, where could they find you?
I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Um, I'm sure you'll tag me on this, right?
Yeah.
So I'm fairly, if you send me a DM, I'm fairly responsive to that. LinkedIn, I'm pretty responsive to that. I have notifications set up, but I would say Instagram or LinkedIn are your best bet. Facebook Messenger, I'm never on. So don't.
Okay. All right. So Instagram and LinkedIn, we'll put those in the show notes, and if anybody wants to reach out to you, go that route. And then just I wanted to kind of get your final thoughts. Like if there was someone who's listening to this who's struggling with PTSD, maybe they're on the fence, they're unsure where to go, what to do, maybe they're just don't have a lot of hope. What's your message for them?
Kind of multifaceted. Like if you are like first responder specifically, and like you're dealing with this stuff, have an honest conversation with yourself on a couple different parts. Like, do you have mental health issues that you want to get figured out or you need to get figured out? And then are you in the right place? Like, are you burned out? Is this the trajectory you want to do? For me, I think it was probably a combination of that. I didn't know the first one, but I was also like, I don't think I want to do 20 more years of this stuff. And I loved the job. But I just had an honest conversation. It took me like 2 years, probably a
Mhm.
year and a half, 2 years to like have that realization. So I would just be honest with yourself because only you know, and then just be brave and go out and do it. Um, get the help you need, and then don't shortchange yourself because I hate listening to cops and military and probably firefighters like, oh, I'm over this. Like, I want to do something else, but I don't know what to do. I don't have any skills. You've heard it, I'm sure.
Yep.
like, you have skills, you'll find your way. You just got to push, and just think big and go after it. Really, that's what you got to do. Be
Yeah,
honest and think big. Like the firefighter thing, like I would have. I think about it now. I'm like, oh, I was just kind of searching for my way. That's all I was doing.
yeah.
So 3
And
weeks, I was like, nope, this isn't it. So on to the next one. Just it's not a failure. I could do the job just fine, but if you quit, then you fail.
yeah, well, and there was no way for you to know if that was the answer for
Yeah.
you or not until you tried it.
Yeah, and when I was in law enforcement, I always heard, "Oh, firefighters, go be a firefighter." And they're like, "Oh, okay, nope."
Yep. Yeah, that's fine. And sometimes you got to try some things, and eventually the right thing sticks. So I think that's
Yeah,
great to be willing to just push through because the transition is definitely hard for a lot of people, but making that choice to make that transition and actually see it through, you're gonna find your
yeah.
way.
Well, they're scared. They're scared of failure because in our professions, like if you fail, we or somebody else probably gets hurt. But
Yeah,
on the other side of the coin, it's not like that at all. Especially if you're going to become an entrepreneur. Like, trust me, man, I fail every day, every day.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
don't quit. I just
That,
keep pushing. And so this thing grows, and hopefully, at some point you reach the pinnacle and you're like, oh, sweet, let's roll. But yeah, that's the biggest difference, man. Being an entrepreneur is pretty lonely,
yeah,
especially if you're coming from a tight knit community. Well, tight knit community, like, it's a lot different.
yeah. And I think I really like that perspective of I never thought of it from that perspective that people think in the first responder field that they don't have the skills, and it is
Yeah,
because they're afraid of failure. But I never did equate it to that when we fail in that field, it's life and death or somebody's hurt. It's bad.
yeah,
Where you fail in the real world outside of this realm, it's not as bad. It's not nobody's gonna die, nobody's probably gonna get hurt. And I
yep.
do think that that probably is a heavy weight because I never thought of it that way, but that's
Really,
very
the
good.
worst thing that could pretty much happen is you might lose a little bit of money,
Yeah.
but you can get it back. It's that even if you lose money, like you might not lose out on anything. You might just lose out on a couple hours of your life. You're like, oh, that didn't work. Let's try something else.
Yeah.
You gotta look at it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rob, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And it was good to talk to you. We'll have
Yeah.
to get together soon and talk.
Yeah, it was great,
Um,
man.
and yeah, well, best of luck in your new ventures. And I'm excited to see it. I love watching it unfold as you post
Yeah.
stuff on social media. It's been good. So yeah, keep going at it. Appreciate you. And guys, thanks for tuning in to Freeing Your Mind podcast. Next week, catch us again for another episode. Love y'all. God bless.
Thanks, dude.